And welcome to Mostly Minnesota Music Podcast Edition. I'm Ann Tracy. I'm here with my co-host,
Heather Baker.
Yes, and we are delighted to have Jeff Goldsmith with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're excited. We're excited to talk about your new album. I'm going to read it off the. May you find the light before the devil knows he's right.
It's quite the mouthful.
It's quite the mouth. I like it. I like it very much. It's my grandma might have a lot of "May the devil find you" needle pointed in her house or had that. So I do like it, but it's
It's definitely like a little bit of a play off of the that old Irish blessing. May you be in heaven 30 minutes before the devil knows.
Devil knows you're dead. Oh yeah,
Yep.
that's always a good one. So it's why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, because this is your third album and you're a sound engineer, and I'm interested to know more, and then talk a little bit about the album.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously I've been making music for a long time, but only as of recently I've kind of delved into like this electronic music. So a little bit of background on me. I grew up in Northern Illinois, and I grew up playing violin, actually. So I was in the Suzuki Music Academy. So I was actually a performer first. They kind of throw you in front of people playing when you're like 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up very much like performing. And the Suzuki method really teaches its students to like learn by listening. So it's not so much focused on you learn a little bit of music theory, but it's more sound based, right? So at a really young age, I kind of just grew attracted to, music and sounds and noise. And so, I played in bands when I was in high school and in college. Again, very performance based, right? I always kind of leaned on other people to help me realize my ideas, because I didn't really delve into the recording aspect much. I did that for a long time, and then I kind of stepped away from music and tried to, be a little bit more career oriented. And then at some point, like 3 years ago, I kind of started doing it again just to see if I could, and I couldn't stop. It kind of became a necessary thing I had to do. And so, I've been making music under my name for like the last 3 years. And this album is kind of the most elaborate and in-depth one that I've done thus far. So
It's really an interesting blend. And I'm a big fan of harsh ambient noise. Thought, when I first started listening, I was like, all right. And then you've got the vocals in it too. It's really a nice merging of the two. I think that alternative electronic is a very good descriptor for it.
yeah, I like dynamics. So I really like things that are extremely loud and then things that are extremely soft. So, when I was making this album, I really tried to kind of, accentuate that. I wanted that to be in the forefront of all the songs, so very loud and heavy parts, and very like quiet and soft parts. So
It's funny because one of the questions when I was listening to it is I thought, I wonder if I'm supposed to turn this up to 11 as I listen. Sometimes I did, because there were parts that I was like, oh, I would, I'd love to be in the back of the kitty cat and hear this super loud.
yeah. Yep. And I struggled with that a little bit, because there's certainly spots on the album where it's so intense, and that can be a little not everyone is ready for those kinds of dynamics, but again, I always kind of figure go big or go home. So hopefully it doesn't scare people away, the super extreme loud part.
Well, I think it pulls the right people to you.
Right.
I was going to say you had something written, the point of writing music and experience music isn't always to make people feel comfortable.
That's exactly right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, oh, that sounds something like, so what you think it was from the violin and the teaching of the sound that kind of pulled you more towards this type of music, I guess?
Yeah, I I kind of got absorbed into synthesizers a few years ago. You know, I started with violin and I really became a guitarist, you know, in my teens, and that really became my primary instrument. But when I started recording music again, I got really absorbed in synthesizers and noise and just designing sounds. And so I think that that's really what pulled me into the kind of this direction, is when you're playing with instruments like that, it just takes you into this world. That, at least that's the way it did for me. I'm naturally always drawn to much darker music, but you know, synthesizers specifically can really help drive you into that realm.
I was going to say, when I was listening to it too, it is in certain tracks in your album, it is hard. It actually kind of gives you the little glimpses of all the shit that we went through during this time, and it's just like, oh, you know, just the layer, and it's like, and then you go down to the slow, softer part, and it's kind of like, okay, you know. Yeah. And then I found it fascinating too, like a lot of clock and ticking sounds too, and it was just like time, like we want to hurry it up, we want to slow it down. It was just kind of this push pull thing, or at least that's what I took away from it.
No, I take that as a huge compliment, actually, because that was kind of my goal. And you know, it's the pandemic and everything specifically that happened in the Twin Cities last year. I mean, it really bled into this record. It was kind of inevitable to have that happen, because you know, this was the thing that like saved me. I needed this project to, like, you know, dig my fingers into. And so naturally, when you're out walking around, and I do like a lot of sound recording, so I take my dog for walks around Nicollet Island, and I'll always be recording stuff, you know. And so naturally, when you're out there and you're recording, you know, police sirens and trains, I mean, that stuff just bled into the album. So
it was a way to soothe you, make you feel productive, or what else did it offer you, just besides the creativity part of it, I guess?
Yeah, I think that I mean, that's a really good question. I think that the creative aspect is always going to be the thing that drives me, but you know, last year was really tough on everybody. And specifically from like a mental health perspective, it's really tough to like be trapped inside and, you know, to not be able to see your friends or your family. And so for me, it was just a distraction from all of that. You know, it kept me really distracted in a good, healthy way. Even though like the subject itself was, you know, the subject in the music itself was extremely dark, it was an extremely healthy and important thing that I had. So I think I'm really lucky in that sense, you know?
Yeah, I was going to say some of it feels like, or I have run a lot in the past, and when you're just exhausted and need to get that out, I could feel myself using some of this music for it. So I felt like maybe that would offer the same sort of physical release to you also.
Yeah, it definitely did. You know, and I do everything myself. So it's like, it's kind of all encompassing in that sense. I can get really dirty and I can do what I want with it and explore things that I wouldn't normally do when I'm making this music. So, you know, I certainly feel lucky to have had like something to cling on to during all of this last year, you know, in this year. So
I feel like there's a progression through the album, you know, and the two songs that I'll point out most are kind of that Venom Purge, and that Venom Purge, I think, has that sound that brings us all back to the week of May 25th.
Yeah.
The sirens, it's, you know, it's an aggressive song.
Yeah.
It's very, you know, and I said it as somebody who, you know, they said, love noise, grew up on punk, you know, like I love that kind of aggression too. And then you took a song like On a Ledge, you know, where you're asking, are you safe? Are we safe? Are we? And it very much feels like a progression through the year, because when we were in that, and all of us in the Twin Cities have that shared experience of 4 a.m. and we're probably watching Unicorn Riot. We got friends on the phone, and we've got, you know, and some of us are out there, and some of us out there at different times. And then that question that kind of came: are we safe? And are we safe? And, you know, until everybody is safe, are we safe? I mean, is that a right reading of the? I mean,
yeah, it is. It is. It's certainly like an arc, you know, and it's, you know, I say this loosely, but it really is kind of a loose concept album, you know, but the timeline isn't super linear, if that makes sense. So when I started writing it, I kind of had a concept in mind, but naturally, when you're watching events unfold around you, that stuff really starts to move into the record, you know? And so, I mean, you're certainly reading it right. It's supposed to kind of feel like an arc, and you're supposed to kind of, I initially really wanted to have like two sides to the album, you know, and you mentioned On a Ledge, you know, that's really kind of like the peak pinnacle moment of the record. And quite frankly, you could have technically ended the album after that, but I kind of felt like there was something else to say, which is why I ended up using the last song, Not Even a Memory, is kind of this, you know, not really a conclusion, but more like a coda, looking back on, you know, all this destruction and rubble that you just went through, and trying to maybe think about it from a different perspective, and trying to, you know, evaluate the things that maybe you've done wrong, or we've done wrong, or anyone has done wrong, if that makes sense.
And that song is more, it's almost like the denouement. I mean, as you said, it really could end on a ledge. It's if this were a British novel, it would have ended there. If it's an American novel, it's going to have that final piece to it. And that even Not Even a Memory feels like the most, I don't know if this is, but traditional.
Yeah.
Of all of the songs that are on the album.
Yep. And it does. And that's, again, that's kind of intentional. I make a lot of music, and it's usually interesting, the ones that I kind of end up driving into and using for albums. And so that one specifically, when I first started recording for this record, I was recording a lot of piano pieces, just like I was listening to a lot of Philip Glass, and I was getting really inspired by the thought of performance piano. And so that one idea is kind of the one that transcended through the whole project somehow. You know, naturally I added a bunch of stuff on it and kind of destroyed it. But yeah, that one specifically, it certainly feels way more traditional than the rest of them. And that's intentional.
Funny, because as you talk about it, I think of The Wizard of Oz. You know,
that's a good comparison. I mean, I love films and I love movies, and that's one of the things I really want to try and do a lot more on the side, is get into film composing. But I always tend to think of things from like a story perspective, you know? And so whenever I start making music and driving into a concept, it always naturally starts to feel like an album or like a story that you're trying to tell, you know? So yeah, The Wizard of Oz would be a good example of that.
Have you ever had anybody approach you, or you offer to have somebody look at it that is in the arts of plays or dance or whatever, to act out some of this? Because I am not as fluent as Anne is in the ambient music, but every time I listen to this type of music, I do create images or emotions. Like, it's so much more vivid than lyrical, and it's just fascinating to me. And then to add somebody that has experience in it, I can't imagine how much more vivid it could be and expressive for both of you. I'm wondering if that's something you tap into, or
yeah, That's a great question. I think that that's something I would love to explore more. Not as of yet. Now, that being said, I've had some individuals approach me to compose music for some commercials. So I have done that on the side. There's a great, filmmaker, videographer out there named Kevin Kamen, who's based out of the Twin Cities, and he does fantastic work. And he's approached me a number of times to do some projects. So, I think that in the future, I'd certainly like to explore that more. But thus far, that hasn't really been the case. When you're releasing music, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and this is aside from making music, like the business aspect portion of it it's the other 50%, right? And so that's something that I've spent more time on with this record, and you kind of get absorbed in that stuff. And so naturally, when I get absorbed in like the business side, I'm not thinking about, maybe the things I should be thinking about, like, oh, this would be cool to look at from like a film perspective, maybe I need to network or look for directors and people to collaborate with. So again, it's something for me to think about for the future, I'm sure.
When you said you've done commercials and stuff, do you already have the song out there, or has somebody approached you and said, hey, I liked what you did here, do it, so then you have to create it off of whatever they say, or do you match it up with what you have already, I guess?
So the few that I've done, people had found my music online, and then it's kind of working together with the director to come up with an idea that will work for both the concept and kind of also utilizing your vision as well, right? So it's a little bit more of like meeting halfway when you start to go into that territory. At least, again, that's the experience I've had with it. Is you're collaborating and you're really trying to match their vision versus someone just coming in and saying, hey, I want to use your music for this, and letting me have full reign, It's a little bit more of a collaborative effort, I would say.
So during that process too, I'm thinking it would be kind of fun to, this is out of the box and distorted and all the things, so I know you can go in a whole different direction, but has it pushed you in other areas too, sonically? Okay.
It has. It definitely has. As of recently, I have been doing some like networking with a lot of film composers, and they've kind of been, the ones that I've spoken to have been encouraging me to release some of that music, but to make sure that you're covering different territory, if that makes sense. You don't want to put yourself into a box, specifically from a composing perspective. When you're talking about film and television and commercials, you want to be able to show all of the different colors as opposed to kind of this one territory that I'm in now. So, as of recently, I've certainly been exploring a lot more palettes when it comes to musical ideas, if that makes sense.
Now, working on this album, what I find is that you're at least two boxes to begin with, because you've got that sort of traditional and then that synth based, the reverb based sort of thing. How do you come into this album? Do you have a vision of what you want to do? Do you start with the lyrics? Do you start with, I've collected these sounds that I want to use?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question. For this record specifically, I wanted to experiment around a lot before I wanted to experiment around a lot and kind of let that lead me to where I needed to go. So in the beginning, I had said I was writing a lot of like piano pieces, but I was also kind of getting back into guitar at the same time. So I was kind of I was doing these like long recording sessions where I was just playing guitar for hours and recording it and just experimenting around. And I think that because of that, like that guitar that guitar oriented vibe really started to kind of drive the idea of where I was going with this album. So, I think that it's different for every project that I've done, but for this one specifically, it was really based around like experimentation in the beginning. I didn't want to like close any doors right away. I wanted to like let the music and the sounds kind of drive me towards what I was going for.
And then once you've got kind of a base like that, I'm trying to think of how to ask this because I've got three different. How do you bring in the sound engineer in you? How do you bring in the recordings that you've done? Do those inform at the onset? Do you bring them in after? Are you looking for a certain type of sound?
Yeah, it happens over a long period of time, over many different revisions and listening. So generally speaking, I usually, the way it usually works, and the way it worked with this album was I kind of started to, create like some collages in the beginning of like, they were collages of sounds and ideas, and then eventually those sort of morph into songs. And then naturally I'll get to some place where I really like something, and then I'll go back and like reconfigure and re-distort it and essentially mangle it all up until it kind of gets built upon itself again. Does that make sense at all? It's kind of just like a very like revision based process. And I'm always listening to my music. So when I finally get an idea, I'll listen to it on my headphones over and over again. And then I'll try and go back to like my lab, my studio and start over again, build upon that stuff or take things away. It's a lot of layers and time consuming, in a good way.
Well, it reminds me. Good.
Oh, go ahead, Ann.
I was gonna say it reminds me of a lot of more abstract artists.
Yeah. Yep.
So it'd be fascinating to see your notebook.
Yep.
Of progression.
Yeah. It's the term I like to use is it's art forward. It's not gonna, people that are listening casually, they're not gonna like this kind of music, This has to be kind of taken in by people that enjoy that sort of art forward music, It's a niche kind of genre,
When you were saying that, it would be cool to add your music into an art gallery for some sort of painting or artist that had this music playing and what was inspired or whatever. I just think the layers of everything, it's so interesting what each individual pulls out of it. It's so telling, or you're like, oh, I get that, or I didn't notice this, or whatever. I don't know. I just find that fascinating what people get from it or how it inspires them. It's kind of a cool thing to take away as the person that produces it too, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on this album, which I didn't actually expect somehow. I mean, it's very dark, right? It's a very dark concept and it's dark music. So when you're dealing with things like that, you kind of, I certainly assumed that it wasn't going to get a lot of positive reaction, and I was kind of okay with that. But thus far, I've gotten, a lot of positive comments and reactions from people on the music, which is, it's been really nice and humbling to hear that stuff,
I think there's certainly an audience of folks who want challenging music. Sometimes I want French fries and sometimes I want foie gras. Give me something rich that that I'm not going to eat every day. But
right. I completely agree. You're not going to get to massive amounts of people when you make this kind of music, but I don't think that that's necessarily the goal. I've always been drawn to music that challenges me as a listener and makes me think and makes me kind of explore things. And so, I know that there's a lot of other people out there that listen to that kind of music as well. There's also some interesting things happening in the Twin Cities, you know, in terms of kind of this dark electronic music as well. I found some really great artists out there. Demonic Devices is one of them, and another band, And I Roared. Just there is some really good like underground electronic music happening in the Twin Cities right now that isn't necessarily at the forefront, if that makes sense.
Well, and Behedresses is what I'm trying to think of some of the others because as I said, I used to go to see, well, of course, didn't we all go see any kind of music, but I used to see a lot of noise. You know, there'd be 6 of us in the audience, but it would be 6, you know,
right.
very attentive, you know, it's.
Well, and you know, there is, you know, it's interesting. So I have done a lot of like campaigning through this album, and I've talked to a lot of like music publishing agencies and just different individuals in the industry. And for some reason, there's always something kind of weird that happens with the Twin Cities. Like people don't really acknowledge it, or, you know, there's better scenes than Minneapolis. You know, I heard that a lot, and that always really bugged me. It's like, well, there really are great things happening here. You just have to find it, you know, and help it when you can, you know. And quite frankly, I have to say, like, that's why I think what you guys are doing is absolutely fantastic, because you're really adding something great to, you know, the state and the scene that you don't necessarily see. You don't see that a lot. So thank you both for doing what you're doing.
Thank you. And I think there's something about, even outside of music, there's something about the Twin Cities that we don't see our own.
Yeah.
We don't see our own, we don't hear our own, we don't understand it. And it's whether you're talking about chefs or writers or business people or, you know, whatever it is, it's, you know, so whatever we can do to kind of get people to.
Yep, I agree. I think my opinion of that is it's kind of its own little bubble. You know, I lived in Chicago for a long time. I'm from Northern Illinois, and, you know, Chicago actually had a little bit of that as well. Kind of these like isolated like places that weren't super attached to like other, you know, cities or scenes. And Minneapolis, or in the Twin Cities specifically, I think has that probably even more so. It seems to be like its own little thing in a good way. It's very self-sustaining and intact, you know?
Yeah, and there are some places where I think I see some mixing, and it's the Kyber Pass Cafe in St. Paul, and they play a lot of very experimental music, and then they have some, because what I saw back when I used to go see a lot of noise, that's looping was very big then. Well, now you're seeing looping on, you know, at the Americana show, you know. Right. So I think a lot of things start to germinate with this kind of more experimental music that then eventually drifts off to something, sometimes to the benefit and sometimes not, but it's, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I can only really speak for myself, but I make this music for me at the end of the day. And so I think that most people that make, you know, like this art forward music, they're making it for themselves. That's always the goal. So if it doesn't get necessarily widely distributed, I don't think that anyone that makes this kind of music necessarily cares, you know, because it's for them, it's for the art, it's for the creation aspect at the end of the day, you know?
So what I'm hearing is you don't want it playing over Ikea when everybody is following the yellow brick road through the store.
I would imagine that my music would not do very well at an Ikea. One of my good friends always says, like, you have to listen to your music at night. Like it's just the way it is. Like, and I think it's true. My music is much better suited when it's dark out, and, you know, ideally when you're just kind of like listening to music alone. You know, I think that's when my music is fully realized for the listener. So yeah, I don't think it'd do well at an IKEA.
Your song "Waiting Room" is funny because it brought just the beginning with the bells. It reminded me of going to church with my grandma. I was like, whoa, wait, where am I going here? So when you're like, you have to be alone, I was like, well, I went to church, so there we go.
That's a pretty funny correlation. And that is church bells, by the way. So there's I live over in St. Anthony, Maine. So like I mentioned, I was walking my dog around Nicollet Island like every night last year, in the morning as well. And I sampled those church bells over there like a number of times. And I at some point I was like, I have to use these somewhere. So waiting window kind of happened to be the one.
It makes me, I live in St. Paul, so there are more church bells around my house than you could ever imagine, and I love them. I love that aspect of it. I do. But it also reminded me of Tubular Bells. Although
Yep. I know so that's a great song, by the way. I've actually had some people mention that to me, like, do you listen to Tubular Bells? And I do, but I actually heard that song through The Exorcist. So that's kind of it's like there's a scene where they're like she's getting checked out by the doctors, and like that kind of cool theme comes in, and that's how I actually discovered The Exorcist. So
Okay, now you're bringing me to your haunted guitar. Is it haunted because of the sounds that come out of it, or what? I'm really intrigued because I actually lived in a place that was haunted. So I'm like, I got to go down that road with you.
Yeah, no, that's so. I have a guitar for the people that are watching this. So I have a guitar that's it's really old. It's like a 1965 Gibson guitar, and I actually just got it last year. And yeah, I was recording it like late one night, and every time I recorded it, I was getting these really haunted, strange sounds out of it. I'd not like they were like really high frequencies. So when I'd go back and listen to them, like that's not normal. And then so I thought, well, maybe it's just the microphone, So I changed the mic, and then it was doing the same thing, and I'm like, this is a weird guitar. So I don't know the history. It's a really old guitar, and I believe that. I believe in the idea that, instruments and places can kind of carry vibes with them. And so that's where that came from. That guitar is a strange guitar. And it always seems to do weird things when I record with it. So
I kind of love that.
Huh? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was intrigued. I'm like, is it the sound that he's getting out of it or what? So I was like, I have to ask that. But I do, it probably meant a lot to whoever was the owner. And they're like, I'm sticking with this. I'm coming along for the ride here.
Yeah. I fully believe in accidents happening when you're recording music. And sometimes accidents can turn into really plentiful, powerful things, and lucrative things when you're making music. And so that specifically, that guitar, and when I was recording it that night, it proved to be one of those accidental, weird, cool things, and I ended up using the tracks, I believe, in the song Venom Purge. So there's a little bit of acoustic guitar layered, kind of buried beneath the mix. And that's what I was recording that night. So.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit about That Witch? That was what I like the imagery of it.
Yeah.
Several of your songs just brought me back to a very specific moment. That one, I wanted to know more about the moment that it.
Yeah. So, conceptually and like sound wise, I wanted the album to just come off intense, and so that was really the song. A friend of mine actually sequenced the album for me, Kyle Trenholm. I played in a couple of bands with him, and when I gave him all the tracks, he's like, that's the song that you have to open the album with. it's just like very in your face, very forefront. And once I realized that, I kind of drove into it a lot more. So I wanted the dynamics of that one specifically to be very intense. Like, you know, even when you listen to it, the first 20 seconds of the song is kind of like this Juno synthesizer just slowly creeping in. It sounds like it's going to be this dreamy, pretty thing. And then you're kind of blown away by, right, guitars and noise and strings and just loud, distorted drums. So that's kind of the path I went with that song. I wanted it to be in your face. Now, like lyrically, that had to be the song that kind of started to tell the story. So, you know, I'm a big fan of David Lynch, so I like people to kind of figure out the meanings of things themselves. But what I'll tell you is that that song really kind of tells the story of abandonment, which is really the driving factor throughout the rest of the album. You know, you have this concept of abandonment and then like the pending fallout after that. So that was really the idea with that witch. Plus, I thought it was really cool to open an album with a 7-minute long song, because who does that? So
I thought what's funny is I listened to tonight before I listened to that witch, and I don't know why, and then that makes so much sense to me because I was like, oh, then I saw that was actually the first one. I'm like, oh, that makes so much more sense. Not that I thought tonight felt like it was not a good one, but when it just pulls you in.
Yep.
It drags you in whether you want to be in or not. I mean,
I completely agree. And I think that, you know, the album, it really is meant to be listened to top to bottom. And that's a lot to ask of people these days, because we're kind of in this short attention span, you know, weird time thing where people want to hear really short songs, which is okay. So yeah, but the album really is meant to be listened to top to bottom. Everything is placed where it's supposed to be, you know? Again, like I mentioned, my friend really sequenced the album, and you know, I'd done recording for like 6 months, and I had all of this stuff, and I couldn't like sort through it. So I was like, I called my friend Kyle, and I'm like, hey, I have like 30 ideas. Can you just listen to them all and like sort through it and like come up with what I'm supposed to do here? And he was like, yeah. And then like a week later, he called me and he gave me the album sequence. And once I had that, I was like, I know exactly where this needs to go now. Like everything was kind of in place at that point. So that was a really important collaboration, I think, that happened on this record, was having him sequence it, because it helped me get away from it and then have a better understanding of where I needed to go following that.
In your previous albums, do you have a certain, I don't think they're concept, but placement of each?
Yeah, my last album, Voodoo, was so I've recorded 3 albums. My first album was really me kind of just figuring it out. I don't really think of it as like a proper like debut album. It's pretty amateur, but like it was a necessary thing that I had to make to kind of like figure out if I could do this again, and if I could go into this kind of territory of like digital world and electronics. And so that one, not really. It was that first album, Finding the Tide, was really just more of an experiment. Now my second album, Voodoo, kind of. So I tried to kind of go down that territory, but I don't think I was as skilled at that point as I am now to kind of like place things properly and to really fully realize a vision. So that album has some flow to it, and I thought that everything felt, you know, nicely placed at the time. Hindsight's 2020, so I recently listened to that album, and you know, I super critical on myself. I'm like, oh, I should have done all this stuff differently, but you know, it kind of got there. And so I guess to answer your question, kind of. But I, that being said, I'm like knee deep in a bunch of other projects now, and all of them kind of go down that very conceptually based concept and, placement of songs and sounds and things like that.
Is that kind of how you like to operate with your music, is to have a sort of idea of where you want to go or what you're doing? Or is it, I know you have a collections of sounds, but just I'm intrigued, and especially since you said Kyle had to sort of help you go, oh yeah, that's right. I mean, and I understand that when you have all these parts and whatever, it's kind of hard to see, and you're like, okay, yeah, you cleared the way again. I was stuck on this little part where I couldn't get past, but it's just sort of intriguing to see or hear you say, well, it doesn't sound, which I feel like that might just be you doing that to yourself too, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah. Making an album, when you do it the way that I do it, it's kind of like swimming out into the middle of the ocean and then like trying to find your way back to shore, if that makes sense. It's like, it's all about getting lost in like destroying everything and then finding your way back. And when you do it all, when you, record it all and you perform it all and you engineer it all, there's a tendency sometimes to get lost, and it's hard to see where you're trying to go or to see the shore per se, right? And so having that ability to like take a step back and have kind of like an external perspective sometimes, like my friend Kyle and, another friend of mine, Pete, also did some like late in the game, he sat with me and we did some like, editing and some conversations about the songs. When you get that external perspective, it helps you to, remember where you're trying to go, if that makes sense. It's just easy to get lost sometimes, you can just get too buried in laying down like 10 different Moog synthesizer sounds and like a 5-second sliver. And then, I'm like, after like 6 hours of programming something, I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know where the shore is. I don't know how I wound up here, So that kind of external perspective is just so helpful sometimes, That's one of the things I really miss about like collaboration or being in a band per se is having that, when you do it on your own, it's just easy to get lost.
So long as you have the people around you.
Yeah. And I, my friends, Pete and Kyle, who live in Illinois, they were in a band with me. We played in a band for like 4 years. And so I'm really good friends they're my best friends. And I'm constantly like texting with both of them and talking to them. And so they're just really good, about listening to my music and giving me feedback all the time. They're kind of the people that I always turn to. So I'm really lucky that I have both of them to give me like a vantage point sometimes, if that makes sense. My wife does it too, but I think she just gets annoyed with me. Like, I'm like, hey, you want to listen to this song again? She's like, not really.
Will you vacuum if I want to listen to the music?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, she's super supportive. She was actually the one that got me back into music.
That's great.
If it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't even be doing this right now. She was the one that's like, music's so important to you. This is your thing and you don't do it anymore. You need to you really need to explore this again. And so, yeah, I shouldn't be so hard on her because she really is. She's the reason that I'm making music again. So.
Well, and I think it's a wise person who recognizes that support doesn't have to mean standing side by side.
Correct.
Sometimes this is the most supportive thing you can do, is say.
Yep. I totally agree.
Yeah, smart woman.
She is.
That's well, I'll take my background. I'm a librarian, and authors have people come in. I mean, not with Sonics, but with other go in and yeah. When you're too close to it, you're too close to it, and when you're too close to it, you see the differences between everything. But when you're new to it, you see the similarities in different things.
Correct. Correct. It's, you know, you're always learning, and it's good to have perspective sometimes, you know. And that's something that my parents actually taught me. You know, it's always good to try and look at things from the other side, or get different perspectives. You know, if you're always driving at your perspective and what you're going for, sometimes you might be missing things. You know, and so yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, it's hard not to think of only driving your perspective and only thinking in the last year and not think of a couple of big name people from the last year.
Agreed. Yep.
You know, you need people around you just to keep you honest, to keep you legit, to keep you, yeah.
I think that that's such a true thing. And, you know, for me, a lot of times that's, especially lyrically, you know, that's what I try and do is I try and understand other perspectives, you know?
Yeah.
No, and I like Venom Purge was very much that, right? After all that stuff happened last May, and I just, the first thing that I did was I just started writing, you know, and I was trying to like listen and understand if I could. And so that was really the idea with that song, was trying to listen and trying to understand, you know, because sometimes it's not about what you have to say, it's about what someone else has to say, you know?
And that's literally about what a city is saying.
Yep.
Which I think is, I do a lot of walks through the woods, and I've watched talks and heard people who film the woods or a forest at one time, you know, and it's amazing. If you walk into a forest, it can seem like visually it's the most boring day, nothing new has happened, but you could hear the birds above are like, what is going on that I don't see? You know,
Yeah.
This song is that, you know,
Right.
The auditory, what is going on in the city?
Yep, I agree. And that song was just specifically just really important for this record. Again, another kind of milestone was like finishing that song, and it just really helped me like understand what I was trying to do, you know. And it's not the most settling song from like a sound perspective. It's noisy and it's loud and it's harsh, but that's what it was happening. That's what's still happening, you know. So it's supposed to kind of be impactful like that, you know.
And some people like, you know, bitter coffee. I mean, it's, you know, it is that it's not for every taste, but for the taste that's there, and it's honest. It is what it is. You couldn't, to try to candy coat something like that would be just on. I mean, that would feel
Work.
I agree. I always try and be honest with my music. You know, I think that that's one of the worst things you could do from like a composing and writing perspectives, is to not be honest. So I always try and do that. But yeah, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. And I think that all the music I'll probably make in my life will probably fit that mold, you know. But that's okay. I mean, the album I'm working on now it's even more weird. It's a lot more beat forward. So I started listening to a lot of hip hop recently, a lot of old school hip hop, so like Public Enemy, like
nice
samplers, right? And so the idea of sampling is such a great thing, where it's like you can record something and then put it in a sampler and like mess around with it and get it weird, and then re-record it after it's been sampled. And so, it's super counterintuitive, but that's kind of what I've been working on lately. So, that's not going to be for everybody. But then again, I don't think Public Enemy is for everybody either.
No, probably not. Good point. Good point. No, I love those mixed songs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think of some of the early versions. Yeah, even just some of the very early versions of rap. Even
Yeah, I agree. I love hip hop, and I've been listening to it a lot more. But hip hop has just always been so experimental. It really is. Even though like it may not seem that way when you're listening to some of that stuff, it was by far some of the most experimental stuff, especially in the 80s. Like Public Enemy and like Beastie, some of those early Beastie.
Oh yeah.
albums, I mean, that stuff is just like sampled. I mean, it's brilliant in my opinion. And I love that stuff. I love like the idea of getting weird and not normal with your music and like doing things that don't really make sense. You know, I don't know. To me, that's what excites. Like I get excited about that. Like the idea of doing something strange and not normal. You know, recording a piano and then reversing it, and you know, just tweaking pitches and frequencies. Like that stuff just excites me. So I get pretty amped up, as you can tell.
I was gonna say it kind of makes you think or on your feet more rather than, you know, you see a trailer for a movie, you're like, okay, yeah, this is gonna happen. You know the whole movie even in the first 3 minutes of a trailer. With your type of music, you're like, wait, where are we going? It gives you that thrill, the aliveness of what's gonna happen here.
I think that stuff is always appealing, you know, and I think that things like that are, again, they're really appealing to people that look for that in music or in art, you know. Like my wife and I were just watching a thing on Banksy, you know, the street artist,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, I was thinking about his like concept of, you know, being anonymous and just popping up like these pieces of art randomly anywhere, you know? And that's super exciting to like people that like that stuff, you know? Like I was watching and I'm like, this is brilliant. Like that this guy's doing such cool things and such a unique concept. So I just love stuff like that. I know there's a lot of other people out there that do too, you know?
Yeah. I was super lucky in that I was in New York when Banksy had sort of a residency.
Oh, very
My
cool.
children were not so lucky because I'd say, where do you want to go? And they'd want to go do, you know, the regular New York things. They're kids. But I would make sure that we would pass a Banksy every time. We walked so far that day. We walked far. But in my heart, and now that they're older, they're like, oh, Mom, damn, nice. Like you have a picture of me in front of a Banksy? I do, Pumpkin. I do. You know, but and I love arts of all different, but those are to me the most exciting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, also with music these days, it's like, how can you get creative and do different things, you know? Because we're kind of in this streaming age and we're in this short attention span. And it's like, how can you try and find a way to be different, you know, outside of that? And that can be hard to do sometimes, you know? But that's why you have to, for me, it's like, it's about taking your time with things and kind of letting them, you know, marinate and grow over time versus, you know, just trying to get products out there. You know, I probably didn't do this promotionally from like, you know, I probably should have released this album like as singles, you know. That probably would have been more beneficial for me from like a, you know, a streaming perspective.
Sure.
The singles, but you know, that what's the fun in that, right? It's about trying to challenge people and do something different if you can, you know.
You'd lose a lot with these as singles. You would lose
agree.
that arc. I mean, you'd.
Yep, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked if I had released it as singles. And I, you know, again, and this kind of goes back to your question, Heather, like, do you always think of things in terms of being like placing things? I've tried to write things as like a single, you know, like, oh, I'm just going to focus on this one song, but I don't think that way. And I don't make music that way. It's like whenever I finish a song or like think I'm finishing it, I'm like, oh, the end of this could go really cool into the next thing. Or like, oh, that other song I have could really flow like really well into this. So I just think of things in more of a, you know, or a movie. That's just the way I think, you know.
I will include into the notes, but can you let folks who are listening know how they can find you online?
Yeah. So I'm pretty active on Instagram, so you can find me on Instagram, Jeff Goldsmith Music. I also have a website, so you can go to jeffgoldsmithmusic.com. So.
And I think that this album is, I enjoyed listening to it from start to finish. Albeit I did somehow transpose the first two, but I think it's something to listen to while you're on a walk, or something to listen to, as you say, at night. I bet on a rainy day, I bet that'd be an awesome listen.
There you go. It's a heavy listen, but that's the kind of music I listen to, and especially when I was younger. So my hope is that maybe someone out there will find it and they'll get attached to it, and then think, well, maybe if he can make this music, I can make this music also. Because that's the way I always thought. So that's always my little lame hope, anyways.
To be the start of a ripple. I think that's awesome.
There you go. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you for an awesome album, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you again both for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Jeff.